Hello, and welcome to our web series, The Impact of Autism on Blindness and Visual Impairment. My name is Lindsay, and I am a board-certified behavior analyst. I will be doing this web series with my colleague, Kristen. We both work at The Village because it takes one. It's an ABA center in Vaughan, Canada. Over the last few years, Kristen and I worked with a client who had the dual diagnosis of autism and blindness. And I admit at first we were a bit stumped as to what to do. When we looked to literature and available resources, we found lots of information on blindness, lots of information on autism, but not a lot of information that combined the two. So we had to do a lot of digging. We had to get creative. We consulted a lot with a multidisciplinary team. There's a lot of collaboration with the family and other key caregivers in the child's life. But we found the process to be hard. And we have learned a lot of things along the way. And we're hoping through this web series that we can share some of the tips and tricks that we've learned to hopefully make it a little bit easier navigating this for other professionals who are kind of in the same boat. What is autism? Sometimes referred to as autism spectrum disorder or ASD. Autism is a developmental disability, and it is marked by two main areas of deficit. The first one is to do with social communication and social interaction. Individuals on the spectrum will communicate in a variety of ways. Some may use alternative or augmentative forms of communication, such as gestures and nonverbal cues, to high-tech devices with communication programs on them, such as Proloquo to Go, and some individuals will communicate vocally. The other key area of deficit is to do with restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior or interests. It is really important to remember that autism is a spectrum and every individual is very unique, and the ways in which their diagnosis impacts them is also very unique. What is applied behavior analysis, or ABA? ABA is a science devoted to creating socially significant behavior change. Our overall aim is to increase quality of life. So we do that in two different ways. The first way is to increase skills. We want to teach skills that are going to be helpful, functional, and again, try to improve quality of life. The other thing we want to do is to decrease unhelpful or potentially even harmful or unsafe behaviors. ABA is really amazing in that it can be implemented anywhere: daycares, schools, home setting, out in the community, anywhere and everywhere. The Expanded Core Curriculum, or ECC, is an assessment tool and curriculum that is often used with children who are blind or visually impaired. There are 9 key subject areas where skills are assessed and teaching can commence. These are the 9 areas of the Expanded Core Curriculum: Assistive Technology, career education, compensatory and academic skills, independent living, orientation and mobility, recreation and leisure, self-determination, sensory efficacy, and social interaction. Today, we're going to tackle the first area of the ECC, assistive technology. Over the last decade, technology has come so far, and the ways in which it can be used to support children who are blind and low vision continues to expand. By teaching special devices and software, it will allow these children to better access their environment, gain information, and ultimately increase their independence. These are the 6 areas where you are likely to note the impact of autism on teaching in the 9 areas of the ECC. These areas of impact include social skills, communication skills, behavior, executive functioning, sensory skills, and motor skills. Assistive technology is often taught for purposes involving social skills and communication. For example, learning how to send a text or an email. However, it's important to recognize that individuals on the spectrum may have some barriers to achieving this. For example, they may initially have low motivation to communicate with others, especially if it's communicating in a way that they are not yet used to. Therefore, you may have to contrive motivation, perhaps through modeling how this communication output will be used. As well, it's important to do an assessment of their social skills and prerequisites. For example, if they're texting, do they know the conventions of texting, and how texting might differ from something that you would put in an email? These sorts of conventions may need to be explicitly taught. As well, it's important to think about safety. Often, when we're using assistive technology for communication, you may be using the internet. So, it's important to build in teaching around safety skills such as internet safety. When considering the impact of social skills on teaching assistive technology, there are a few considerations that you can make. The first is start small, especially if your goal of teaching around the assistive technology is social in purpose. You might want to start with teaching it with familiar people to the individual, and maybe even starting with just one person before branching out to using it with different people. It is really key to always think about the learner's motivation, especially when introducing a new technology, thinking about the ways that might be interesting to them to utilize the technology and starting there first. You also want to try to build in safety and boundaries with assistive technology from the onset of teaching. Setting very clear rules and expectations from the get go can be very helpful in avoiding barriers down the line. It is important to remember that communication deficits are a core deficit of autism. Often, to further analyze communication, we break communication down into two key areas. The first one is receptive language. That's our ability to understand language that is delivered to us. A learner with receptive language deficits may have difficulty understanding instructions that perhaps contain complex language or that are multi step instructions. The next key area is expressive language. That's our ability to communicate our wants and needs, or comment or converse with others. A learner who has deficits with their expressive communication may have difficulty with their self advocacy. Therefore, they may have trouble asking for help. Since we are aware that communication deficits are a core deficit of autism, it's important to keep that in mind when we're teaching assistive technology. The first thing I always like to consider is their prerequisite skills. The first one being learner readiness skills. For example, are they able to attend to a lesson? And if so, for how long? If they're able to listen consistently for about 10 seconds at a time, that gives you an idea of how long your teaching window should be before taking a break. The other is, can they follow multi step instructions? Often, when teaching assistive technology, there are multiple steps that need to be followed in order to properly utilize the technology. For example, a computer, there are multiple steps needed even just to turn on the computer and open a program. Are they going to be able to follow multi step routines? Once you're actually in your teaching, it's also important to keep your instructions clear and concise. Even more complex instructions can be broken down into smaller, more manageable, and digestible steps. It's also really important to start with a small expectation and then scaffold from there. We suggest that you start with an expectation that is going to be motivating for the individual. So, for example, if you are teaching them to use iTunes, it might be helpful to teach them how to actually play a song. That way, the minute that they push the play button, they're going to be reinforced by hearing their favorite song. Once they get that skill, you can start to scaffold how to navigate within the program, how to access iTunes. All of those things can be scaffolded after the fact. Now let's talk about behavior. Children on the spectrum may demonstrate rigidity or a need for sameness, structure, and repetition. Due to this, they may have a decreased tolerance for unexpected changes, problems that may arrive, or even just surprises along the way. For example, Wi Fi issues or a battery dying may be challenging for them. This lack of cognitive flexibility can often lead to difficulties kind of holding two truths about a given piece of technology. For example, if they initially learn to use something for leisure purposes, later down the line, learning it that it can also be used for academic purposes may prove to be a challenge. In order to prevent challenging behaviors from occurring, there are a few considerations that you can make when teaching about assistive technology. We highly recommend providing rationale and explanation before beginning your teaching. Talk to the individual about what they are going to use, how they use it, why they use it, and really just explaining what it's for and how it will benefit them. By setting very clear expectations and guidelines from the beginning, it prevents any surprises down the line. It is also important to consider that individual's history with the device. Certain assistive technology, like a computer, for example, can be used for both leisure purposes as well as academic purposes. If in the past they only used it for leisure, it may be a little bit more of a challenging transition to now also use it for academic purposes. This is where your rationale and explanation are going to be very crucial to setting clear guidelines as to when the technology is used for one purpose versus another. What is executive functioning? We're talking about a repertoire of skills that we use in order to plan something and then execute that plan all the way till its termination. This includes numerous skills, some of which could be organization, time management, and problem solving. That means children on the spectrum may have difficulties with problem solving issues that come up with assistive technology. For example, a paper jam may be difficult for them to learn how to problem solve. However, this does mean that learning to use assistive technology as a problem solving tool will be very helpful down the line, but it means they may need some additional support in understanding how these problem solving tools can be useful. A key component of executive functioning is our ability to problem solve. And we use problem solving skills all the time when navigating assistive technology. We also use problem solving when learning a new skill. So it is really important when teaching assistive technology that we are building in problem solving skills from the get go. We use what's called gentle sabotage to set up opportunities where we can practice problem solving with the learner in a contrived and safe setting where we can kind of guide them through the steps. That way, when these things come up naturally down the line, there's no need to panic and they already have the skills to deal with that situation. So, exposure and guidance is really key here. It's also important to expose the learner to multiple possible functions of a device. Even if you're not explicitly teaching those other functions at the time, it's helpful to just expose them to the fact that a device can be used for multiple things. Now let's talk about sensory needs. Children on the spectrum may be either hypersensitive or hyposensitive to different sensory inputs. Therefore, the idea of exploring a new assistive device may be a little scary, as it comes with exploring new sounds, new feelings, and all sorts of different sensory inputs. As well, it may affect their tactile discrimination. It may feel uncomfortable at first for them to explore something new with their fingers. As well, this also means they might be sensitive to volume output. So it's important to be able to control the volume in case they don't like it too loud or they need it louder. It is hard to anticipate how a learner will respond to the new sensory experiences that come with learning and assistive technology. Assistive technology comes with all sorts of new sounds and tactile experiences. Therefore, it's really important that when we're first introducing it, before we jump into teaching, we allow the learner time to just explore on their own terms. That way, they can start to explore the type of sounds and tactile experiences that come with that device. They also should, during this exploration time, be able to pause or terminate at any time. It is really important to start this on a positive note with very positive experiences under that learner's control. It is also important to determine the learner's tactile discrimination threshold. With using assistive technology, sometimes we have very small tactile differences, say between two buttons on a computer. It is important to know whether they have the prerequisite skills to be able to sense the difference between the two through touch. As well, it's a very important skill to teach the learner how to control the volume of a device. That way, if ever they feel the device is too loud or not loud enough, they have control of that sensory input. The last area of impact is motor skills. Some individuals with autism may have deficits when it comes to either their fine motor or gross motor skills. If they have deficits with fine motor skills, that may impact both their strength as well as their endurance with different tasks. It also might affect their ability to modulate pressure. For example, they might push down on a keypad too hard or too light. It is important to be aware of your learner's strengths and limitations when it comes to fine motor skills. Many forms of assistive technology require fine motor skills to effectively utilize the device, for example, typing on a computer. If your learner struggles with fine motor strength or endurance, there are lots of different fun activities that you can do to help build their strength and endurance. It is also important for you to kind of know their limitations and know when they've reached their threshold. It is important to take breaks as needed. You never want to just push through because that can make the task that you're teaching become aversive for them. You also want to be able to rule out any underlying barriers. We often find it helpful to consult with an occupational therapist to rule out any fine or gross motor deficits and develop a plan for addressing these deficits. Don't forget to check out our handout for our first ECC area, Assistive Technology, including possible impacts and considerations. Thank you so much for joining us today in part one of our web series, The Impact of Autism on Blindness and Visual Impairment. Today, we talked about how autism may impact learning about assistive technologies. Thank you so much for joining. Here is our contact information if you wish to reach out. Thank you.